Thank you very much, William. And it's really great to see so many people here today. So what my brief is basically to go round and in sort of 20 minutes talk about the entire conservation department and our work. So, which is a bit of a challenge, to be honest. So there's just over 50 people now in the team. So we're doing lots of great stuff. Okay. Basically, the conservation department, I suppose, in a way, does what it says on the tin. We're basically, as Chris said, protecting what we've got, trying to bring back what we've lost. But if I could chunk it up into 4 different things, it's our nature reserves, it's our wildlife advice outside of nature reserves right across the Suffolk landscape, it's our consultancy, which is something that people forget about, but a really important part of our work, and our planning and advocacy. Now, Rupert's going to be talking about that in a bit, so I'll only touch lightly on that. But basically, those 4 areas of work are areas that we think, in terms of the relatively limited resource we've got, we can have the biggest impact right across Suffolk. So, nature reserves, as Chris touched on, they are the crown jewels. And they are, we're not going to bring back wildlife without protecting our nature reserves. And it's actually, it's the sort of, I suppose it's the essence of the Wildlife Trust. And if you think about the Wildlife Trust movement right across Britain, many of the trusts have been founded on really important, really iconic sites where they've had to go in, whether it's the 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, save those sites from whether it's development, pollution, dredging of rivers, whatever it might be. Whereas in contrast, the RSPB, for example, is much more of a campaign-y organisation in origin. And actually, it's quite interesting that we work very closely with the RSPB very well, but you can see the difference there. We've got the Wildlife Trust, many reserves, RSPB fewer, generally bigger reserves, have a really big campaigning part of their charity, raptor persecution, things like that. But actually, you can see the combining of those 2 charities makes a conservation movement that's actually really effective. So in terms of Suffolk, I guess we've got 2 sort of, I suppose, you might call parent reserves. This is Bradfield Woods. Bradfield Woods, really special site, longest continuing coppice woodland in terms of record that we know of, we've got records dating back to 1252, culturally within the landscape, massively important. Some of the stools in Bradfield Woods, ash stools, up to 1,000 years old. Just a fantastic habitat, incredible. Lots of different wildflowers, really good for birds. Butterflies are fantastic, white admiral, purple emperor, magnificent reserve. That was saved by local community protecting the wood. I should say it wasn't completely safe. 2/3 of the wood was grubbed up before it was protected. What is the magnificent Bradfield Wood is 1/3 of what it used to be. Redgrave and Lopham Fen, Lowland Valley Fen, one of the few areas of deep peat within the county. Again, really biodiversity, incredible 270 different plant species found in that reserve. And there's 1 or 2 other valley fens along there, which sort of provide an incredible linear habitat along the river, River Waveney and Upper Little Ouse. Again, this was a reserve that was under massive pressure from abstraction, and it still is to some extent. Massive campaign to close that abstraction, to save it, and that was, both of these 2 reserves were really the genesis of Suffolk Wildlife Trust, and we'll never forget that. But of course, it's not just about 2 reserves. In fact, we've got around 50 reserves across the county, with a really good spread of habitat. So I talked a little bit about the Lowland Valley Fens. Obviously, we've got the coastal strip where we are, with incredible diversity within quite a small area, from the marine into tidal, freshwater, mudflats, freshwater reed bed, lowland wet grassland. Lots and lots of reserves, which are obviously reflected in that. And then a little bit inland, you've got the Sandlings Heath, light soils, really important for heathland. We've got the coppice woodlands, which is basically a sort of cluster around here. We've got these are mainly wildflower meadows, traditional hay-cut meadows. And then, of course, often off the radar, an incredibly biodiverse, rich area called the Brecks. Sadly, most of that land is owned by large estates, and it'd be lovely to buy the Euston estate, but I suspect that will always be slightly out of our price range. So Suffolk's blessed with incredible habitats, and I think by and large our reserves do an amazing job of protecting some of that best habitat. And I'm just going to touch on 4 of those reserves locally: Hazelwood Marshes, Snape Marshes, Foxborough, and Trimley. And I'm going to touch on those because obviously they're local, but also they give a little bit of a flavour of what we do. So Snape Marshes, I've called it 0, which is a little bit unfair, to be honest, but it's certainly a hero now. This was a marsh that it was okay, but it didn't really have any consistent breeding wader habitat over the last few years. It's a small reserve. It's just over the river from Snape Maltings, if you don't know. You walk over the bridge and walk along the footpath. It's a lovely little walk. Now we've got 8 pairs of lapwing, highest productivity in Suffolk. It's not just about quantity, it's about quality as well. Highest productivity in Suffolk. It's like better than Carlton Marshes, better than Minsmere. It's something to be proud of. 4 pairs of redshank. It's really difficult to monitor productivity in redshank, so we sort of monitor just pairs because the chicks just basically hide in such long vegetation. But it was great to get that. We never used to have any redshank there. And a lovely pair of oyster catchers with 3 juvenile oyster catchers. But perhaps as well, in terms of the management of our swards, 7,000 southern marsh orchid this year. Amazing, amazing. It's difficult to see it from the wall, to be honest. But yeah, really amazing stuff. So how have we brought that back? It's about good management. It's about appropriate cattle and pony grazing. It's about foot drain management, keeping those foot drains open and having rotations. Rotation of scrape margins, the really shallow open water with the really shallow sort of around sort of inch deep wading habitat that's so important for the early stages of breeding waders. Excellent water management, obviously, but it also is obviously the additional protection from fencing because of Mr. Fox here. Sometimes forgotten about in terms of breeding wader management, really important. There's actually a predator fence here. You can't actually see the predator fence, bizarrely, but believe me, there is one there between lapwing and Mr. Fox. This rather beautiful animal spent at least 2 weeks just looking through that. Amazing, really. So, quick thing. Why are foxes so impactful on breeding waders? It's because we've got honeypots. We've got these nature reserves that are really important, but they attract predators. If we had a natural landscape, if we had diversity in a landscape, if we had structure across the landscape, that really reduces the predator effect. But we've got these small nature reserves bringing predators, and that's the reason why we've got to think about predation on our nature reserves. Foxborough Wilding, some of you will go there later. It wasn't so long ago that we basically had considerable area of the nature reserve that was contracted out to arable under a contract. When that contract ended, we made the decision to wild it. And when you go around, you'll see the beginnings of that really exciting wilding journey. And you can just begin to see that marginal scrub. Sometimes I call it the Cinderella habitat. It's forgotten about. It's not appreciated. Really, really important, that gradation from woodland to grassland. Our wilding, the way we do wilding, we're not purist wilders where we are wilding. We realise that actually to maximise that ecological uplift, you need to put in features. So this is an invertebrate bank that we've put in south-facing, really warm, really important for solitary bees and wasps. Here's a pond, wildlife pond. We've put in several ponds around the reserve. If you don't put in these structural habitats, you get less niche habitats and fewer species coming in. So it's really important, we feel, to not be too purist about it and actually do a bit of work before we start wilding. And you'll see that at Martlesham Wells as well if you go for a walk round. Hazelwood, another local reserve. Incredible site, 2013, surge tide. Some of you will remember that. Huge East Coast surge tide. This reserve used to be a freshwater reed bed, freshwater triple SI, nesting marsh harrier. Surge tide, it blasted through the seawalls. And overnight, we effectively lost a freshwater triple SI. Crisis, oh no, the reserve's knackered. It's not going to recover, not true. Over time, it's recovered into an incredible intertidal habitat. So what has that told us? That's told us that actually, in many respects, when you let nature take its course, you get natural functioning in an ecosystem. The reserves behind the seawalls in all of our estuaries, freshwater reserves, can be really good, but they're there despite the walls, not because of them. You take the walls out, you take a river out of its straitjacket, and you get natural meandering across the floodplain. And if you look at the rivers in Eastern Europe and places like that, that's proper wildness. And we have to make do behind structures often like these seawalls. Trimley Marshes. So Trimley, some of you will know near Felix, incredible birding reserve. If you're into birds, go there. There's always really interesting things. We've got breeding pochard there, which is like a really important record for Suffolk. But I think what's really interesting about Trimley is that it's a really shining example of being able to work in the community. And obviously you're hearing about Marchant Wilds. But now we're beginning to work with the wider Trinity estate. It's been a long game, to be honest. But in the last few years, we've put in around the wider estate well over 3 kilometres of native hedging. We're creating marginal ride management around a lot of the woodland. We've now got nightingale on the estate. And, you're beginning to see all the wildflowers and stuff coming back. So it's a really good example, I think, of a reserve that become bigger than the sum of its parts. Number 2, wildlife across Suffolk. It's not just about reserves, and I mentioned that. Alice is going to talk a little bit about rivers, so I won't touch on that too much. But we work in basically 4 areas. We work with 2 farming clusters. 2 farming clusters here, River Blythe and the Upper Giffing, and we work on what's called 2 landscape recovery projects: the Wallows project and the Connecting Gainsborough and Constable Country projects. These are trailblazing projects, and I honestly mean that. The landscape recovery being funded at the moment by DEFRA, we're the only wildlife trust in the whole of Britain that has 2. I think Lancashire have suddenly got 2 now, so I've got to get my facts right. But for a long time, only 2. This is about long-term investment, working with farmers at a landscape scale to try and help their businesses do better stuff for wildlife in a sustainable way. The idea of these projects is basically trying to create private investment into farming businesses. And it's really important. Things like carbon credits, for example, investment from water utilities for improving water quality, things like that. We invested a lot into our landscape advice over the last few years, and really now we're beginning to see the fruit of that investment. And you can sort of see here, these are the number of landowners that we are working with that own over 50 hectares of land. We've completely blasted that out of the water. And so we are genuinely having a big impact across the landscape, and that is clearly so important about when we come to bringing wildlife advice back, bringing wildlife back. I mentioned Wallows, and these are just some of the metrics that we are working with. We work with a range of external consultants who are specialists in areas to try and start bringing those ecosystem services that ultimately will be sellable to the market to help farmers farm more sensitively in a sustainable way. So you can see some carbon, you can see phosphorus reduction, reducing runoff to local rivers, obviously really important, floodwater storage and nitrogen as well. These are really important things that farmers can do that help wider society, but also help wildlife. But of course, it's not just about big farmers, it's about communities, smaller landowners. So we run a private nature reserve network. So these are very often people that might have 5, 10 acres. They have a particular passion for wildlife. We've created a network, basically a peer-to-peer network, so people can advise, people can visit each other, people can really give each other that inspiration, that motivation to keep on going. The idea being that we don't own it, we're like an introduction service, for the want of a better word, and we step back and we help create that groundswell of work. And that, I was quite surprised not many people do that around the country. That apparently is quite a new thing. We run what's called a green hay network. So number of people who've got wildflowers, wildflower meadows, they take a hay cut and they donate that hay cut to someone who's got a meadow that might be really impoverished and might have been historically improved. When I say improved for like pasture. So they can, and you scatter that green hay on the area, and a lot of those seeds then drop out, and then you get loads of, in the next few years, you get lots of wildflowers coming up. That's been really successful. We work very closely with Suffolk County Council on County Wildlife Site Network, really, really important. So that's basically the sites that sit below the national SSSI network. Many of those sites are just as important as SSSI's, and there's lots of them. So we help manage that, we help do monitoring, we help provide advice to people. We work with village commons, we work with churchyards, we work with a lot of wildlife groups. And in certain situations, we provide species-specific support. And I'll talk about that a little bit. So we do lots of other stuff at a smaller scale. Here's an example of some of the work we do. So we Save Our Swifts. This is in partnership with Suffolk Ornithological Society group, and we basically go out and put swift boxes in consultation with local groups and local parishes. This is an example. This is a church that put in, I think, about 60 swift boxes, of which about 50 odd are occupied. It's fantastic. And actually, you know, I mean, you can just see the number that we're putting in here. And one of the biggest, definitely one of the biggest, swifts are massively under pressure, as you might know, and it's basically the loss of nesting sites, really. So we're putting a lot of work into that. Stag beetle, what a magnificent animal. We're really lucky to have a really good population of stag beetle in the southeast part of the county. Our largest terrestrial beetle, and you can see we're putting in a huge number of log piles. These aren't little things. You know, you can see it's actually diggers. And those of you who know a bit about the ecology of stag beetles will know that dead wood needs a lot of it, probably 2/3 of the quantity. For it to have a good uptake with stag beetles have to be underground. You're burying dead wood. But it's not just about stag beetle. You know, a lot of our work in terms of species, we're thinking about the ecosystem. So a big thing that's missing from the wider environment, the wider ecosystem, is dead wood. So we provide something for stag beetle, and it helps a whole load of different species. But stag beetle are A, really fascinating, and B, is something that grabs the public imagination. And that's what's really important in a lot of our conservation work. You've got to think of the species not just in terms of whether it's important for its conservation, but can you use that species to grab the public imagination? We've also invested massively in a lot of our wetland stuff. Alice is going to talk about some of that. But you can see we've put in the last few years, well over 200 wildlife ponds, something that's missing right across the landscape. And clearly putting in wildlife ponds is going to help a vast range of species. And a lot of river restoration work, and I won't go into much more than that, because Alice will touch on that. I'm delighted to announce that we are now investing in our marine and estuary conservation, which is really important. We've always sort of done it a little bit off the side of our desk, and hand on heart, I feel as though we're sort of at the front end of much of conservation, but we've probably been bringing up the rear on marine a little bit. We're now investing in a marine program. We're going to have a marine program manager coming in, and that is going to be the start of lots of really interesting things. We hope lots of habitat restoration, native species reintroductions, oysters, seagrass. We'll see what happens. Lots of work to do there, but really, really exciting. I was going to play this clip. Some of you may have seen it. David Attenborough clip on bottom trawling, but I realised this week quite late that these days on YouTube, unless you're paying a subscription, you get a load of adverts at the front. So I'm going to save you from the green flag advert and just simply say it's worth going on YouTube and pressing and looking in that, because it just shows you the devastating impact of bottom trawling. It's really quite heartbreaking actually seeing it. It's worth looking. Out of sight, out of mind. We want to do much more work on that. I am delighted to say that just very recently, about the only decent protected area of marine offshore, inshore, I should say, off Suffolk, Orford inshore, Natural England has just said, and Marine Management Organisation have just said they're going to ban bottom trawling there. And that's something we really pushed for, so that's great news. Wilder ecology consultancy, often off the radar. Really important though, not only does it bring money to charity, and basically all the profits from the consultancy go and help fund charity work, but it's also really important that, our clients show that they care more about nature, because effectively we are demanding of those clients. We're not just trying to do greenwashing. We expect them to do that little bit more. Our clients show that they care more about nature. And a shout out to Essex and Suffolk Water. They're one of our biggest clients and have been really brilliant about embracing effectively what we want to happen in nature when we work with them. And over the last 4 years, we've influenced about 400 hectares to improvement for wildlife. So that's fab. Rupert's going to talk about planning and advocacy, but I just want to touch on two things briefly. And this is sort of planning advocacy work that's often hidden. You don't necessarily hear about this, but these are two things. You may have heard about the trials and tribulations of Kittiwake at Lowestoft. We pushed quite hard in the background to do more for Kittiwake, and several years of advocacy. The council thankfully invested in a Kittiwake officer. But before that, a lot of the reactions of local businesses to nesting Kittiwake was basically netting them off. And here's a really good example of some of our work. This is the old BT building, Kittiwake nesting on the ledge along the front, annoying people. They wanted to put a netting up, and we persuaded them to actually, rather than doing that, put the ledges around the back that no one ever went to. And almost immediately, our friends, the Kittiwakes, decided that was a sensible place to nest. That's a great solution. That's the sort of work you might not hear about. West Suffolk Hospital over at Bury St Edmunds, a massive scheme. They had 4 options, and despite our lobbying, they went for the ecologically most destructive option. But through, rather than sort of just throwing our toys out the pram and going home, we carried on working with them. Ultimately, that resulted in a 100-hectare nature reserve as compensation for that. We don't have that nature reserve. It's actually privately managed, as it were, but there's 100, and not open to the public access, unfortunately, but it's 100 hectares of nature reserve that wouldn't happen without our direct intervention. So what's it all about, really? It's about wildlife. It's about fantastic wildlife, isn't it? That's everything we do, and let's not forget that wildlife that we have in Suffolk is incredible. And clearly this picture, this is a buzzard mobbing a white-tailed eagle. This was taken not so long ago, a couple of years ago, at Carlton. And I just think it's fantastic, because it wasn't, when I moved to Suffolk in 2011, and buzzards in the east, well, you didn't see them that often, did you, really? You really didn't. And you see them all over the place now, which is great. But now we're beginning to see these guys. Isn't that just incredible? And of course, it isn't just the big stuff, it is the small stuff as well. Nature is so incredible. We just got to open our minds and our hearts and think about it and absorb it. And I think that's really, really important. So this is a little film footage taken at Lackford on the Lichen Heath. And this is a solitary bee that specialises in laying eggs for its young in empty snail shells. And I just wanted to share this with you. I think that's amazing, isn't it? How many of us would just walk past that and not notice it? I don't know whether you spotted, but there's also a little grasshopper somewhere up here. And there's something here as well. But anyway, lichen heath, incredibly important. So I just wanted to finish off by thanking you for all your support. You know, we've managed to invest in so much, particularly of our off-reserve work, our consultancy work, and our planning and advocacy. And the bottom line is, without the support of our members, all of you, it really wouldn't be possible. So thank you very much.